us knows very well, but nevertheless, let's introduce our speaker. So Danilo got his PhD in USP, and then he had a postdoctoral appointment in USP for 4 years. After that, he moved to Cornell, where he stayed 7 years, right? A lot of time. And in 2022, he came back to Brazil as a Jovem Pesquisador, as we know, here in ICTP-SAIFR and Unesp. He received also several awards, like he got in 2020 the Rising Stars in Soft and Biological Matter, right? And then he got in 2024 another award, the FAPESP Sprint Award. And as we know, he's an expert in the theory of soft matter, statistical physics, superconductivity, and related things. And today he's going to give a talk about statistical physics and functional design of disordered elastic materials. Danilo, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Dario, for the introduction. It's always a pleasure to give you a seminar here. And today I'm going to talk about these topics here, which involve a bit of statistical physics, and mostly these disordered elastic materials with some emphasis on functional design. So let me talk about what I mean by this. And my talk has 3 parts. I'm going to talk a little bit about the past. Here I'm going to talk about previous work on jamming and mechanical metamaterials, and then move on to the present, where I talk about the correlated disordered work done by graduate student Jorge Escobar Agudelo, who is here, and then say a few words about some future work, and it's kind of ongoing work on active solids. And that's going to be the ghost of Christmas yet to come. So let's start with the past. So before talking about jamming, I thought it would be useful to put this whole idea of universality in statistical physics into context. So I remind you that, I mean, when I did my graduate school, as Dario was mentioning, I went to USP, and there we had this lounge. This statistical mechanics group has this room where people hang out to drink coffee and do stuff like that, and they have the frames of people who are very important on statistical physics. Some of them you probably know, Boltzmann, Gibbs. Maybe some of you don't know Maria Meyer here, which was also have made some important contributions. And if you were to design this room today, maybe you would think about adding some more people on this. And this is my personal flavor, because these people were important for what we call today phase transitions and critical phenomena. They were very relevant for that. And I don't know if you know these guys. The guy here in the middle is actually a high-energy physics guy, Ken Wilson. And here is Michael Fisher and Leo Kadanoff. And these were the guys that were responsible for the development of the renormalization group. And these guys were particularly important in the statistical mechanics side of renormalization group. And renormalization group, you know, it's the theory that it gives the fundamental understanding of what we call phase transitions and critical phenomena. And I don't have time to go into very many details about renormalization group and critical phenomena. And just to say a few words, the whole idea is based on this idea of scaling variance of a critical point here. I'm not going to explain this in details, but at the critical point, you have this scaling variance, and what turns out is that all length scales become important here at the critical point, and from this, you can extract a property that is really important for critical phenomena in general, which is this idea of universality. You know, there are some critical exponents and many other quantities that do not depend on microscopic details, and this is the idea of universal behavior in critical phenomena in statistical physics. Now we know a lot about this, and actually this is one experimental plot here that just shows more or less this idea here you have 8 different fluids where you have just rescaled the temperature and the density, and this is the liquid gas coexistence line, which ends here at some critical point there with some characteristic critical exponent beta here. And for all these different kinds of fluids here, you have the same universal scaling function describing this critical point here. And not only that, what's more surprising, at least for someone who has not yet learned about critical phenomena, is that not only fluids, but actually this critical exponent here is the same as you would get for the Ising model in 3 dimensions. So you have different systems that have nothing to do with each other, like fluids in a magnetic system, an Ising system, that have the same critical exponent. And just a quick advertisement here, I'm actually teaching a course on critical phenomena next semester. Some of the students. Say that again? No, it's not mandatory. It's just because I copied that it's the 2nd semester. And anyway, it's not. They are not. No, yeah, you do not expect the behavior to extend very far away from the critical point. And then you have, you know, this is not perfect. This is an experimental system.
Or is it that the theory is not critical?
I would say that 2 things play a role here. There are, of course, experimental error bars there. And then there are things like corrections to scaling that are also important in critical phenomena in general. So the theory, the simple fit here for the simple power law does not incorporate the corrections to scaling that would appear. But this is minor. For an experimentalist, we can actually ask you one experimentalist in the room. For an experimentalist, this is almost perfect agreement.
No, I'm asking a theoretical question. I'm asking is, if you do the experiment with infinite precision, does it have to be on that line or not?
No. That's what I was saying. There are corrections to scaling.
Okay,
yeah, there are the 2 things.
Right? For these systems, right? As you calculate loops, that's not right. I'm talking from the relativistic version of it, right? Then there are corrections coming from loops.
There are many kinds of corrections. There are analytical corrections to scaling. There are singular corrections to scale, which are actually corrections that are singular also. So there is this whole field of really.
In some sense, the 1/3 is actually corrected by loop calculation. So it's not exactly 1/3, it's a little bit different. But different fluids and the magnet itself have different beta functions that differ at higher orders. And that's the reason why that they would differ as you go further away from the critical point.
So in other words, the corrections are not universal.
No.
Only the leading behavior. Okay.
Yep. So here we are. So what's the reason why I'm talking about universality here in this context? So we know about universality in many different systems, many different simple and not so simple systems. But a particular type of system that's very hard to say anything about universality are disordered systems. And here I'm putting here disordered elastic materials, elastic materials between quotes here. I'm going to say why I'm putting that between quotes. But there we don't have a genuine renormalization group approach to describe these systems. We can talk about universality because we have some signatures, some indications that we have universal critical behavior for this kind of different systems. Here I have granular matter, confluent cell tissues, structural glasses, even strange metals. That's why I'm talking about elastic materials between quotes. You're going into even outside of this kind of elastic materials that we have here. Strange metals have some signatures of the same kind of critical behavior, I would say. And then things that are not even condensed matter are correcting codes in machine learning. They all have some sort of underlying universality there.
Sorry, here you are putting together classical and quantum systems, right? Strange matter, okay.
Yeah. That's the thing, yeah. Exactly. Again, there are signatures. There is no genuine renormalization group approach to put everything there in the same universality class. So what I'm going to do next is to leverage this, assuming that these systems are kind of universal, leverage this supposed universality to come up with simple model to systems describing these general disordered elastic systems, between quotes, universality. So let me talk about these granular matter systems and these jamming transitions to begin with. So suppose you have a bunch of disks or spheres in 3D, if you wish, and you just apply some isotropic compression on this. And you want the disks to be polydispersed in size, have different size so that they don't crystallize. So you apply some compression on them, and what you expect to happen is that at some point they will jam, and they form this disordered elastic network here that will resist the compression. That's a jamming transition. And the way we describe this is by looking at the behavior of the elastic moduli here as you ramp up compression. And I don't expect people to know about elastic moduli because this is not usually taught in undergrad or grad school, depending on the area in which you work. Just to have a very quick introduction, you are thinking about rigid materials, solids, or things like that, and you're applying some deformation on these objects. And then there are two kinds of deformations here in general: bulk deformations that will change the volume of the object, and shear deformations that do not involve any change in the volumes. And these moduli are the actual energy terms, the energy penalties that you would have for these kinds of deformations, bulk or shear deformations. So at this jamming transition here, you form this disordered contact network at some critical point there where the bulk modulus jumps to a finite value and the shear modulus grows continuously from zero. So this is jamming. This is a very quick introduction to jamming. There is a kind of transition that's very similar, and I'm going to show that I can come up with a model that's very similar to that one to describe jamming. And this is this rigidity percolation transition. Here it starts with a network. It doesn't have to be a regular network. I'm going to use a regular network because we can do anything with periodic lattices, or most things with periodic lattice. I'm starting with this network here. This is a mass spring system, so it's just a bunch of masses with springs connecting them, harmonic elastic interactions connecting them. And then I'm going to dilute, remove some bonds here in this network. What happens is that the coordination number, the average connectivity for each site in the lattice, starts decreasing as I remove more and more bonds. The system becomes floppier, less rigid, so I can deform it more easily. So the elastic moduli decrease until they hit this critical point here where both go to zero.
Sorry, the fact that the initial lattice is frustrated play a role, or it just...
No, it doesn't play a role here. For the kind of interactions that we have, it doesn't play any role.
Okay.
If we're going to
I was wondering why triangular and not quadruple.
Okay. So there is a reason for that. There is you can use very simple arguments, and I'm going to comment on this later on, where you can find this threshold, this critical coordination number here, using constraint counting arguments. It turns out that it's 2 times the dimension. This is the critical coordination number. The square lattice, for instance, is right at this critical point, this isostatic point. So it doesn't make much sense to remove bonds in the square lattice. It has to have more coordination larger than that. And then the triangular lattice is isotropic. It has other properties that are convenient. Now this kind of model here, this is difficult. It's difficult to simulate. It's difficult to treat it. It's very difficult to treat analytically. People have done some progress going to infinite dimensions, and there are some theories for jamming transitions in infinite dimensions. But if you're going to do this in finite dimension, it's difficult. But this guy here is easy, or easier, at least. It's amenable to analytical calculations. And then the problem is that it doesn't have a jump in the bulk modulus. But now I'm going to leverage this supposed universality and argue that maybe I can come up with a simple lattice model to this jamming transition. And that's the kind of model that we have. And I'm going to explain this quickly because I want to get into the present and maybe comment on the future. So let me just talk about this quickly. What we have here is a kind of a smart combination of two lattices here, the honeycomb lattice and the triangular lattice. And I'm choosing these two particular lattices because they have the properties that I want to describe jamming, for instance. The honeycomb lattice there, which is this blue lattice here, it has a bulk modulus that's already greater than 0, but the shear modulus is 0. And then the triangular lattice has both moduli greater than 0. Now I can, this is again a mass spring system, and I can assign some independent occupation probabilities of the bonds, a PB for the honeycomb lattice, and a PN for the triangular lattice. And then I can calculate, for instance, my average coordination number, Z here, in terms of this PB and PN, and it's going to be equals to ZC. It's going to be rigid when this Z here is greater than ZC, which is two dimensions for this kind of systems. Okay? And I can treat the disorder in these systems using this analytically tractable theory. And I'm going to say...
By occupation, you mean the presence or absence of a spring in a certain link? Eh?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, occupation is this. Exactly that. So I'm going to say more about this theory because I'm going to give you an extension of this theory, which Jorge's work, later on this talk. But for now, just believe that we have some analytically tractable theory to deal with the disorder here. The masses are the same. The masses are the same. The spring constants are the same, except that I can remove some. So it's either K or 0, for instance. But I can change this. I can put two masses. I can put different spring constants. This is all generalizable in general. This is the phase diagram, and I'm just going to mention here, this is rigid. If these probabilities are high, you have most bonds there. So you expect the sink to be very rigid. If the probabilities are low, you have few bonds, you expect you can deform it without spending any energy. That's the idea of this floppy mode. At some point, you can deform the lattice without changing the distances between pairs of sides. This is what rigid percolation is. So you have a floppy phase here where the moduli are 0, a rigid phase, a rigid percolation line where they grow continuously from 0, and a jamming point there where B is greater than 0 and G is equal to 0.
These configurations where you can have elasticity, are they stable or unstable?
What's unstable?
when you deform the elastic material,
I'm imagining I can do this very slowly, quasi-statically. I'm not doing rheology. I'm not doing something that will depend on strain rate. I'm doing it very slowly. I can deform it and
but if you deform it, it stays in the new position.
only if you keep the deformation. This is elastic. Okay, I understand now what you're asking. This is an elastic regime. If you apply some tension or some stress in the system, it will deform. If you take out the stress, it's going to restore to the original
Okay.
place.
Okay, thank you.
You can incorporate and study other things where you have plastic behavior where anyway, but that's not, this is all elastic. Yeah. So just for the experts, we can do scaling collapses here. If you don't know what scaling collapses are and how these, or haven't heard about universal scaling forms, don't worry about it. But we can do all of them, and most of them we will agree with what we expect for jamming transitions. So this is one of the proofs that we have for that the theory works well for jamming in many aspects.
It's a single parameter scaling, right?
Yes, in this case, yes. But it depends on the quantity. For instance, we can have quantities depending on wave vector, something that will involve, for instance, the correlation length and things like that.
This is analytic, or this is...
This is analytical, yeah.
So how do you decide which bonds you're going to remove when you have a probability, but how do you know which ones?
They are independent. Okay, so this is something that's going to change for the second part of my talk. But each bond that I'm assigning here is assigned with a probability P of existing and 1 minus P of being absent.
Yeah, but it's random.
Completely independent and identically distributed in the lattice.
So it's random. how you
It's
choose.
random, yes.
And you have an analytic result for a random distribution?
That's right,
of-
that's right.
But doesn't it depend on how you...
It is an average, but if you do a simulation, there will be error bars or...
Simulation, I understand, but you said it's analytic. So you do a computation and you say
It's
that-
an average, so you have an effective median theory that maps this system, this diluted system, into a homogeneous system.
Ah, okay, so that's the trick. So you
Yeah,
map it into some continuum system.
You map into a homogeneous system, and when you map, the moduli go to zero, exactly zero at that line.
Okay.
So you see this phase diagram that you have here. In the effective median theory, in this map, the moduli go to zero exactly here. But then again, if you do a simulation with the random diluted network, there will be fluctuations, yes.
But also, I think, Danilo, another important point is that it's an infinite system, right? So you benefit from self-averaging, which is the principle that the fluctuations shrink to zero proportional to the size of the system.
Yeah, there are some subtleties here for this particular, for the triangular lattice in particular. For jamming, near the jamming point, the fluctuations very much go to zero, and you expect that to be exactly that point. But away from it, you do have something that survives here in the system. So there are some subtleties. Yeah. So here we are. Yeah, scaling collapses, we can do all of that. So what we've done so far, so we have this jamming transition, and we leveraged this supposed universality to come up with very simple model, analytically tractable, that we can describe it. And one of the ideas that maybe we can use is some similar idea to design something, some functional mechanical metamaterial with some specific properties. And I'm going to focus here in one kind of material that's kind of interesting, which are these auxitic materials. I don't know if any of you have heard about auxiliary materials. Rogério.
I have a very simple question. So you're talking about phase transitions, right?
Yes.
Jamming, for instance. So what is the analog of temperature in this case? What is varying that?
The average coordination number. This will be the parameter that I'm controlling. That, yeah. The average coordination number, I'm decreasing the average coordination number. You can do it lots of ways if you think about this experimentally. But yeah. So I'm going to focus here on one particular type of metamaterial, which are these auxiliary. Actually, I've asked people, and I don't know if the right pronunciation is auxiliary or auxiliary. If someone knows, please let me know, because I don't know. And I've asked people, and people don't know. Exactly. That's a good one, yeah. Yeah, so conventional material, right? You take a piece of material and apply some stress, some tension on it. What you expect to happen is that it's going to extend here in this direction, and it's going to shrink here in this direction, because it kind of tries to keep the volume more or less conserved or something like that. So this is what you expect for a conventional material. But auxiliary, or auxiliary, I don't know, don't do this. If you extend it in this direction, it actually extends also in the perpendicular direction. And I should be a better presenter and show the videos on the internet, but I didn't. Anyway, you can check the videos. There are cool videos on the internet showing this kind of behaviors. And yeah, if you do the opposite thing and compress the thing, the conventional material will extend on the other direction, whereas the auxiliary material here is going to collapse, like, and compress this way and compress this way. So a couple, one way of characterizing these materials, this is more or less a circular definition here. You have a Poisson ratio here that characterizes. You don't have to worry about these names, but this characterizes this kind of behavior. It's positive for the conventional and negative for the auxiliary. Again, this is kind of circular. So auxiliary are the ones with negative Poisson ratios. But anyway, I'm going to use the Poisson ratio there because I know how to calculate it for isotropic networks, for isotropic two-dimensional networks. That's just given by this formula here, in terms of those moduli that I told you about not long ago. So a couple of years ago, these guys from Penn, they started with a network very close, that they built very close to a jamming transition. And then they realized that they can cut bonds on these networks in some smart way so that they would have some auxiliary behavior, induce some auxiliary behavior in the network, or some regular behavior. You can pick the bonds based on the effect that the bond has on the elastic moduli. If you affect mostly the bulk modulus, so you can pick the right bonds and get something that's auxiliary. If you affect mostly the shear modulus, you get something more conventional. And this motivated us to actually come up with something that's, again, analytically tractable based on some suitable combination of networks with the right properties to describe this kind of behavior. And this is this. For this, I'm going to use, again, the honeycomb lattice. And I'm not sure if I told you. I think I told you that for this lattice here, you have the bulk modulus greater than 0, bulk, compression, things like that. Shear modulus equals to 0. And if you plug this into this equation, you realize that for this, you have conventional, it's back, right? Okay. Maximum value that you can have for the ratio here. It's the most conventional material that you can build out of these isotropic two-dimensional networks. And on the other side, you have this twisted Kagome lattice, which has G greater than 0 and B equals 0, and it has a sigma of -1, which is the minimum value of this. So if you if you can combine these two networks and start cutting bonds independently, you can write down something that you can tune by associating the same way that I did for jamming. You combine the two networks and you can tune the Poisson ratio simply by assigning probabilities of occupation for each bonds of the lattices, of the two lattices. This is, again, analytically tractable. We have these auxilic transitions, more general jamming points that appear in this system, and it's a kind of interesting, cool mechanical metamaterial.
So in this twisted Kagame lattice, you don't have springs anymore, do you? You have these sort of triangles.
We have springs. The drawing might be confusing because I'm coloring the triangles, but it's a mass spring system again. I didn't emphasize it because
they're not rigid triangles.
They are not rigid
Okay.
triangles. My bad.
Oh, thank you, thank you.
It's something for the sake of having cute figures. That anyway. This is a mass spring system, the same way that we had before. So let me talk about the present now. So first, I feel very fortunate to be here and be in contact with really remarkable graduate students and researchers. So it's a great opportunity. So it's really the work that the research that I'm going to talk about is mostly done by these amazing guys. So let me talk about correlated disorder first. I told you about jamming, right? And I told you that we can come up with this very simple random elastic network model for jamming, etc. One thing that I didn't emphasize was the fact that each one of these bonds here, the occupation probability I'm using here is based on these independent and identically distributed random variables. There are no correlations between the disorder elements here. And this might be fine, might be a good first approximation for many systems, many different kind of transitions, including jamming, as we have shown that it does reproduce many of the behaviors that you expect for jamming.
And these variables are Gaussian?
They are not Gaussian, they are bimodal in this case. I just have a probability
right.
P and 1 minus
okay.
P. In principle, I can do Gaussians also, but anyway, yeah. But these are, the point that I want to make is that rather than the rule, this seems to be actually the exception. And the fact that there are no spatial correlations between the disorder elements. And there are many other cases, I'm going to mention two here, but there are many cases where actually the correlations are very important. And you can see the structure here. This is certainly a disorder structure. This is not crystalline in no sense. But you can see there are spatial correlations there. If you have a particle here, it affects the probability of having other particles around. So there is some correlation length here associated with this disorder structure. And another example here that I can mention, maybe, again, there are cool videos on the internet. If you have not seen this, this is kind of cool. You have something that's really a liquid, and you can walk on it, or ride a bicycle on it, or do something like that. This is a solution of cornstarch. And the physics behind this is what we call shear thickening, shear also mixing with shear jamming. And the point is that I'm not going into the details about the non-Newtonian fluids and things like that, but the point here is that, again, in these shear thickening and shear jamming materials, you get a structure that tends to form some force chains and things like that that are correlated in space. And these correlations play a very important role, and they have to be taken into account to have a more complete theory. So let me emphasize just these colloidal gels for a moment. You can come up with a very simple rigidity percolation line kind of model for these colloidal gels. These guys have attractive interactions which generate this disordered correlated structure, and the way we can incorporate this is by thinking about a triangular lattice again. Again, the lattice itself doesn't matter too much, but you can do something with a triangular lattice again. And then you start placing particles at the empty sides of the triangular lattice, right? With some probability P here, which I'm going to talk about in a second. If you have neighboring parts, you put up a spring between them. So there is a spring there between neighboring parts. And you repeat this process of adding particles with this probability P here until you hit some packing fraction here, some target packing fraction phi. And that's what you get. And the way we're going to do this is instead of doing this independently, you have some correlation parameter there, some C there, and my probability of adding a particle into an empty side depends on the number of nearest neighbors that are already occupied there. So if you have C equals 0 here, then you just have 1, so you just put particles on empty sides randomly on the lattice. This is completely uncorrelated. This is C equals 0. But if C is different from 0, you are giving a bias when you have more particles on it. So if you have more neighbors, the probability of adding a particle there in the middle is larger. So that's how you incorporate correlations. Now what these guys observe is represented here in this plot. As you can imagine, as you increase packing fraction, you increase phi, you go from a floppy phase to a rigid phase. If you have more particles, you have more bonds, you become more rigid. But this seems to depend on this C parameter here. If C is 0, which is the uncorrelated case, this is this dashed line there, you have some critical threshold. If C is greater than 0, this threshold decreases here, and you have what we expect to be some sort of hypostatic behavior. I'm going to talk about what I mean by hypostatic. So you get something that becomes rigid at lower packing fractions. So it seems to be some sort of hypostatic behavior. So as I was mentioning to Dario at the beginning of my presentation, there is a very simple constraint counting that you can do to find what you expect when this network structure becomes rigid, becomes mechanically stable. And what you can do is that you count the number of floppy modes, those modes which cost 0 energy. And this is the number of degrees of freedom minus the number of constraints that you have in your system. So if you do this for a periodic lattice at some dimension d, for instance, what you get is that this is 0 exactly at this isostatic point. This is what people call the isostatic point, which ZC equals 2 times the dimension. So that's the point where you expect it to be rigid. And then, because you need 2 particles to create a bond between them, you have a coordination number here that you expect to be proportional to phi squared. Then your correlations would imply the fact that this is going towards lower phi. What you expect is that your correlations would imply that you're becoming rigid at some point below the isostatic point, below isostaticity. That's what we meant by this hypostatic behavior. Now, this is not true. This is true only for C equals 0. That's one of the methods that we found out. But let's talk a little bit more into details about this. So I told you that we have used this coherent potential approximation, this effect median theory, which is our analytical theory, to map the dilute system into a homogeneous systems that we can do all the calculations about. And I'm going to just go very quickly explain to you what this approximation is, what this coherent potential approximation is. What we describe in the system, one way of describing all the properties of the system is by calculating what we call a Green's function for this elastic network system. You have a force that can be applied here in the nodes of this network, and the displacement can be found from the application of the Green's function on the force, for instance, the force on the network. And then there are many techniques that you can use here to, if you do a perturbation on the system, you can calculate the perturbed Green's functions in terms of the unperturbed Green's functions. And what we do in the coherent potential approximation, this is based on this single impurity perturbation here. You consider that everybody has an effective spring constant Km there, and you have just one bond that's different with a spring constant K prime, and this Km is to be self-consistently determined based on some condition that I'm going to impose on this perturbed Green's function here. And this is what is at the root of this coherent potential approximation. This has been introduced by people who work on electronic structure in the 50s or 60s, I don't remember exactly when. And it's been used in many contexts. And the CPA, what the CPA does is to consider that the average Green's function here, of the perturbed Green's function here, is this bare Green's function, this bare propagator here, which is equivalent to make this T matrix here, the average T matrix equals 0. And this gives a self-consistent relation that should be satisfied by this effective spring constant. So in the end, what you get is that you start with a diluted network system, and you map it into a homogeneous network system with this effective spring constant Km that should be obtained by applying this self-consistent equation here for the T matrix. Now, what Jorge and Rui did in Jorge's master thesis was to generalize this idea now to incorporate spatial correlation between the disordered elements in the system. So to do that, you cannot keep just the single impurity approximation that we have used in the general, the coherent potential approximation that I mentioned before. You have to do you have to consider the perturbation caused by multiple impurities. You have to do blocks instead of that, of just a single impurity. And then again, you do the same formalism. And of course, the calculations, the equations become much more complicated, but you can still do it. You have to rely on some approximations. I don't have time to go into the details. But what we get is that we can apply the same kind of model that we had, for instance, for these colloidal gels, the rigid percolation kind of model. And this is the phase diagram that they have there in the simulations. And what we get is something very similar to what they got using this analytically tractable effect median theory, this correlated coherent potential approximation there. Of course, you can calculate K as a function of phi. In general, you can analyze this general scaling behavior of this. But one thing that we emphasize is that even though this looks like it's subisostatic, even though it looks like it's becoming rigid at some point that's below the isostatic point, if you plot this in terms of the average coordination number, you get exactly the same isostatic behavior for all of them. This is something that was not realized before in the description that the simulations, the previous paper had. What they believed was that the correlations were induced to this subisostatic behavior. And it's not exactly this. What the correlations do, actually, is to increase, if you just, this is the uncorrelated case, this yellow line here. If you plug in the correlations, the K increases because you are increasing the average coordination number effectively. So that's what's causing it to look like it's subisostatic when it, in fact, it's not. And that's one of the important messages that we got here from this result. Now, more important than that, this was done for this particular kind of system, this rigid percolation model for gels. But what we did here was actually a generalization of a method that can describe many other different systems with this special correlated disorder. So now we have this multi-purpose approach that we can use to describe different kinds of systems with spatially correlated disorder. And then we can describe things like shear thickening and jamming and fiber networks and cartilage and topological mechanics and many other kinds of systems. Okay? So I'm going to go fast here because this is yet to come, so I'm just going to make some comments on some ongoing and future projects that we're tackling. And this is here in collaboration with Hartmut Loven from Düsseldorf, and then William and Pablo here from ICTP. And the main motivation for this is that there are lots of very interesting results on active matter, lots of interesting results regarding metamaterials and glasses and disordered elastic systems. And it has become important to actually understand the interplay between this activity in the system and the elastic behavior of these networks, of these disordered networks. And I'm going to show very quickly a model that explored this interplay. And towards the end of this talk, I'm going to mention that this some possible applications of systems that would involve this system. So suppose again that you have a triangular lattice which is simple to treat and so on, and you populate it with some active elements. Here I'm putting ants here, but they don't have to be ants. They might be other kind of active elements. I'll talk about cells later on. But you put these active elements there, and they are active, so they have some persistent motion in some direction. They can change this direction, but there is some persistence motion in some direction. And these ants here are going to move here on this network. They are not going to overlap with the other ants, and they are going to move persistently. And the rule for this model is that if they move here through this bond, they break the bond. So this is the rule. They can break the bonds, and if the bond is broken, another ant that come this way and try to move here, it's not going to be able to pass through the bond that has been broken, and so on. And those bonds are going to be healed after some healing time tau. Now, this is a very quick simulation for these kind of active particles moving here on these networks. As they move, they can break the bonds, and they can be stopped either by other particles or by the bonds that have been broken by other particles, and so on. This is for a low packing fraction. This is for a higher packing fraction, and I'm coloring here with red the ones that are stopped by one reason or another, and with green with the ones that are moving. And
Sorry, but in some, it looks that they overlap, no? I mean,
they do not overlap. If you see them overlapping, it's
I should do a high control. I should do a check on my vision, no?
no, they are not supposed to overlap. If you see them overlap, it's a bug in the visualization too. But it's they're not supposed to overlap.
After some time, shouldn't many bonds should be broken?
They have healing. So the bonds, after some prescribed time, characteristic time, they are put back in the lattice.
Okay.
Okay? So there is an interplay between the motion of the particles and the healing, and the interactions with the other particles. So here you have something that has a nice interplay between active particles, active motion.
But do they interact? No, they interact just blocking each other,
Blocking each other, that's right, yeah. Blocking each other, and if they leave a trail, the other particle cannot go that way, so it's, yeah. Now, I'm not going to describe the details here. We're exploring transport properties and many other things in these systems. I'm just showing here that we're finding something that's counterintuitive, but since this is futurish kind of work, I'm not going to describe this. And just jump to just the last part of this. One of the applications, I've shown this to people in Cornell, some collaborators in Cornell, and they got excited about the idea of applying this kind of model to studying the behavior of a system, a cartlet system, where you have an extracellular matrix here. This cartlet, you know, this tissue, this connective tissue here that goes in between, for instance, your bones, and they do involve, for instance, a fibrous network there, much like, in many ways, model the same way that we model the elastic network that I've been telling you about earlier. And of course, there are some caveats, there are some extra interactions that you have to take into account. But anyway, you have a fibrous network there forming an extracellular matrix, and then you have some cells that can move in this extracellular matrix and do all sorts of stuff. They can break bonds, they can repair bonds, they can push on the network, and do all this kind of things. And we're collaborating with Ty Coyne there in Cornell to see if we come up with a model much like this that would describe these cartlet extracellular matrices and the behavior of these active cells on this, and we're excited about this. And William in particular is involved in this also. We expected some different kinds of rigidity transitions that are driven by something that's very dynamic, that these are dynamic behavior of the active elements acting on this elastic network. And there is this expectation of having this experimental validation here in Cornell. And maybe even more ambitious, maybe we can think about programming these cells in some way to adapt to their environment in order to do stuff, in order to optimize their environment to their benefit in some sense. So this is on future work, just to give a very quick view of this general thing. So that's the end of my talk. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Danilo. Time for other questions. Okay, you can use the microphone, right?
So most of the comparisons for universality with jamming that you have for these networks are mechanical properties, right? Like the response functions and things.
Yeah.
But then there's this other world of people arguing about universality with jamming from the, Silvio Franz and Giorgio Parisi and Francesco Zamponi, who argue that these constraint satisfaction problems, like the spherical perceptron, also are in jamming universality. But they use like the gap exponents and things like this. But it doesn't seem like any of the properties of the constraint satisfaction problems can be directly compared with these networks. Do you have any idea of a universality that these could share maybe and close the triangle?
I know about these different kinds of works exploring the gaps and things like that. We have not explored that yet. I don't know if that's possible to use these networks in order to address, but we should definitely talk more about this set and set kind of transitions. That, yeah,
it'd be very
definitely,
interesting.
Yeah.
Am I mistaken, or everything you did was in 2 dimensions?
That was in 2 dimensions, yes.
Why?
Because it's simpler in many ways. The generalization to 3 dimensions do not give us anything that's unexpected.
Unexpected?
Yeah.
Well, then why don't you do 3 dimensions? Isn't
because
that
it's computationally costly.
Yeah, but don't we? I thought we wanted to describe 3-dimensional materials.
We can. I mean, it's almost ipsis literis the same theory that we describe in 2 dimensions. We have an analogous theory in 3 dimensions. The original paper, for instance, we did for 2 models, one in 2 dimensions and 3 dimensions. 2 dimensions is much easier to compute everything.
But then how do you know it's the same in 3 dimensions if you can't compute?
We have computed. We have a, the same way that we have the honeycomb lattice with a triangular lattice.
Yes.
In 2 dimensions. In 3 dimensions, we have the so-called diamond lattice. Right. It has a coordination number Z of 4, which is smaller than the critical coordination number for 3 dimensions, with 6. With an FCC lattice, you combine 2 lattices the same way. The theory goes essentially, apart from minor differences that do not matter, it's the same theory. It's the same scaling behavior. It's the same theory. So,
but
yeah.
If it's the same, then why is it more complicated? You told me it's more complicated.
It's more complicated to compute things.
But you know it's
because
the same,
you have a 3-dimensional system. It's just the computational cost is higher. That's just it. It's easier to draw things in 2 dimensions. It's easier to explain things showing pictures in 2 dimensions.
Sure, but you say the theoretical computations are the same.
Let me rephrase. The scaling forms are the same, apart from corrections that might exist in 2 dimensions, because they are close to. Okay. There are some subtleties, such as if you are close to the upper critical dimension of the system, you expect to have some more corrections. So there are corrections in 2 dimensions, but then the dominant scaling behavior is the same that you predict in 2 or 3 dimensions.
Okay, thanks.
More questions? Okay, perhaps I can ask one very simple question. For the last part that you showed with Pablo, and that is out of reach analytically, right? Everything is simulations.
Well, everything so far has been done in simulations. So we have done simulations.
But do you put in your agenda?
It's not impossible that a theory like the one that I described using Jorge's result
can be used in that case.
Can be used in that case. Because what we have there is actually an especially correlated disordered system. It's correlated because if a particle moves here, it breaks a bond. So if I see this broken bond here, it affects the probability of having other broken bonds.
I see.
So it falls into the same kind of thing. So in principle, we could do also theory, analytical theory for.
Is it in your agenda or not yet?
It is. We have other things to do before,
Okay.
but anyway, yeah.
More questions? Okay, if not, we can thank Danilo again.
Thank you.